What's up, you guys? Justin Roos here. Tonight is the final saga of Sony versus Panasonic in this kind of ongoing epic battle of YouTube world domination. Now, having shot about 200 videos on Panasonic and then selling it all and switching to Sony, and now I'm about 100 videos in on Sony, I can just tell you this. There is no one platform that is absolutely better than the other one outright. But depending on what you're shooting and what you're doing, there's definitely one that's going to be better than the other one. Now, again, it comes down to you and what you're doing. But those people who are out there say, oh, Sony crushes Panasonic or Panasonic crushes Sony, that's simply not true unless it's like something very specific that you're doing. Now, the thing is that you have to make the decision for yourself of what's going to be better for you. And you can't just say, hey, should I get this one or this one? Well, there's so much context involved in what you're doing that when you're asking those questions to me or other YouTubers, make sure you break out exactly what it is you're trying to shoot and do and what's most important to you. But what we're going to do today is we're going to go through cost and video quality and usability and talk specifically at the end about vlogging in regards to these two different platforms, because they are different. They've got their strengths, they've got their weaknesses, and we kind of have to break it down to make you informed so you can make a good decision. But remember, at the end of the day, what I found out between these two platforms is I could make either one of these work for whatever it was that I was doing. It mostly comes down to you, your skills, your abilities, but one is going to make your life a little bit easier. Again, depending on what you're going to do. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to kind of break it down and go through the list here. First up is cost. Cost-wise, I would definitely say that Sony is more expensive. In general, there are going to be exceptions to that. I mean, they both make budget cameras. This is the Sony a5100. I think US is just over $500. Panasonic has something like the G7, again, just over $500. So you can get into something relatively cheap. But I find once you start getting up a level, Sony's start to become a little bit more expensive. This a6500 that I'm shooting on, which is a 4K shooting with in-body image stabilization. In Canada here, I paid $17.50 for it without a lens, and you could get a G85, which is in-body image stabilization, 4K with actually a couple more things on it, and weather sealed for like $1,200 Canadian. So I find that Sony gets a little bit more expensive, especially too, like the G Master lenses for Sony are wildly expensive. A 70 to 200 is like $3,000 here in Canada, whereas a Panasonic, what would be the 70 to 200 millimeter equivalent, the 35 to 100 f2.8, is like just over $1,000. Now, those aren't necessarily apples to apples, but those are two high-end lenses, and the Sony lenses as a whole, I would say, are definitely expensive. So Sony can be a little bit more money as a platform, but obviously there's cheap and there's budget lenses and there's other ways to work around that, but typically you're going to probably spend a little bit more with Sony than you would with Panasonic. My experience, what I've been looking at buying and different things I've been looking to spend money on, that is what I have found. Now, let's talk about video quality, because some of that is a caveat, because Sony has a bigger sensor size, and what that means is Sony can blur the background a little bit more, which is going to give you that more cinematic feel, and it's also going to be better at low light than what the Panasonic does. Now, it doesn't mean Panasonic isn't good in those regards, especially when you pair it with the right lenses and you're set up properly. You can still get great quality video even at low light situations, but you really need to know what you're doing. But as a whole, Sony, especially you've got crop sensor cameras, which are bigger sensors than the Micro Four Thirds in here. And then if you actually go to a full frame Sony sensor, where I'm talking about a $3,000 lens is built for a big full frame sensor, that video quality is going to be, far and away much better than the Panasonic. If you're talking about things like low light capability and that really cinematic blurry background, the bigger your sensor is, the more it blurs the background. So Panasonic is just stuck on the physical limitation of having a sensor with half the surface area of a full frame sensor and about 50% less surface area than a crop sensor that's in like the 5100 or the 6500, 5000, 6000 series cameras. So in that regard, the video quality coming out of Panasonic is maybe not going to be quite as good, if that's your definition of good. If you're not trying to blur that background really hard and you've got lots of light, well, then it's going to be a little bit of a different story. Let's talk about 4K, which is a very, important in some people's mind this these days. Now, 4K is not the be-all, end-all, and a lot of people are never going to see your 4K content because they don't have 4K monitors yet. There will be more and more of those coming, but I can tell you a well-crafted story or a well-shot 1080p clip is going to be better than a poorly shot 4K clip. And again, lots of that comes down to your ability to light a scene, to be able to, shoot properly, to know your settings, to do all those kinds of things. So 4K isn't the be-all, end-all, but where it can be nice too is editing, is that you can shoot a little bit wider and then you can punch into a tighter shot, or you can fake some pans and some zooms and some other things. Pretty much every Panasonic camera these days comes with 4K. Whereas on Sony, the A5100, the A5000, the A6000, they don't come with 4K. You basically have to set up to the A6300 or the A6500. And then too, some of the full frame cameras on sale these days don't have 4K. I mean, the A7S Mark II and the A7R II, those have 4K, but the regular A7S doesn't. So you just kind of got to watch that on Sony, and depending what you're after, if 4K is really important to you, you're going to have to spend more money to get 4K, whereas a Panasonic $550 G7 has 4K in it. Sony, you're going to have to get, up over the $1,000 range to get into, an A6300 to be able to shoot 4K. Something to keep in mind when it comes to movement, if you're trying to move the camera, Sony's, especially in 4K, have bad rolling shutter. What that means is when you move quickly and you're panning, the lines end up not being straight. There's a number of technical reasons for that, but the more, especially if you're hand holding and shooting 4K in Sony, it's not going to be as smooth as on the Panasonic. And some of that is just the nature of how bad that rolling shutter is. I've also found the in-body image stabilization, taking the A6500, comparing it to the Panasonic G85 or this GX85, it isn't as smooth on the Sony. And I think some of that is a physical limitation of you've got a bigger sensor in the Sony in these small bodies, and it just seems like they can't give it quite the same range of motion, whereas a Panasonic, it's a smaller sensor, sometimes in a slightly bigger body, and so they can make it float a lot more on that in-body image stabilization. It's probably a little bit subtle, but there's definitely a difference there, especially with the rolling shutter. Panasonics feel more smooth. They just do, anyway, in my experience. Something else when it comes to video quality, which on high-end shooting doesn't really matter, is colors. Now, why I say it doesn't really matter is because, Sony, once you get up into the more serious cameras like this A6500 or I believe 6300 or the Panasonic, G85 or some of the more serious cameras, you can shoot in like S-Log is what Sony calls it, and I think on Panasonic it's like the Cinelike D or V. Basically, they're completely flat color profiles that then you color correct afterwards to bring out the really nice colors that you want. But if you're not shooting in that, I find that the Panasonic colors are better, more natural. I find the Sony's they're really pink, and I struggle with getting a nice skin tone on the Sony if I'm not shooting completely flat and editing the color afterwards. So when I was vlogging on the Panasonic, I would just basically set the color profile and hardly do anything in post because I liked the way that it looked. Whereas the Sony's, I'm having to fiddle a little bit more with the colors coming out of the camera. Could be personal preference, but that's generally my feeling. I hear that from other people as well, is that the colors on the Sonys are not quite as good as something like on the Panasonic. Again, there's definitely ways around that. Shoot more flat, color correct afterwards, but it just requires a little bit more work. So let's just kind of recap that video quality section and talk a little bit about, okay, so am I saying one is better than the other, or why would I want to use which one for depending what you're trying to do? If you're trying to make cinematic movies, I would absolutely say go with the Sony because you're able to blur that background more. And that is honestly the number one telling feature of a cinematic video is typically when, people are talking, you're shooting over the shoulder and this person's out of focus, but the eyes of the person that's talking are really in focus. Or when you're doing that close-up shot of that person's face and their eyes are in focus and their ears start to get blurry. To me, that is, a big part of cinema. And so that is going to be much more difficult to do on the Panasonic. You're going to have to spend more money on lenses to be able to try and blur that background more because, again, you're just dealing with a smaller sensor size. Whereas the Sony, you can grab something like this. This is a 50mm 1.8, and you can get those kind of shots where the eyes are in focus and the ears are really out of focus. Whereas, probably to get something similar on the Panasonic, you'd almost be looking at something like the 85mm 1.2 Nocticron, and that is in Canada here, $1,800 lens, in the States probably $1,200 or $1,300, whereas this, US-wise is $250. Now, Nocticron's probably slightly sharper and different things, but as far as being able to quickly get that cinematic feel, sensor size there is going to make a bigger difference, as well as the low light capabilities. And, you know, lots of cinema you're shooting in more compromised lighting. So in that regard, I would say pick the Sony. And typically with those cinematic shots, you have more time to set up around, you know, not all run and gun. You're using stabilizers, using tripods. You're doing more of those things where you're not going to notice that rolling shutter as much. Again, depending on the scene, depending on what you're trying to do. But if that's your goal, is I want to make really cinematic movies, I would start with the Sony. The other thing the Sony has is they have a higher quality 1080p option. This gets a little bit technical into the, you know, the bit rates and the data rates of basically how much you're compressing the video coming out of here. Both Sony and Panasonic 4K, 100 megabit per second. It's kind of the same. But when you're talking about 1080p, Panasonic shoots about a quarter of that at around 22 to 28 megabit per second, depending on the mode you're talking about. And Sony can shoot 50 megabit per second. Basically, they can capture twice as much data at 1080p, unless you're moving up into the, you know, the GH5 or GH4 or GH3 series of Panasonic, which are the higher end bodies. But as far as just, you know, being able to pick up the Sony A5100, which is really inexpensive, it can shoot 50 megabit per second 1080p coming out of it, which is nice and clean on a bigger sensor, and the video quality out of it looks like surprisingly good. And again, if you've seen videos out there and you might see them where they're like, oh, Sony's video isn't very sharp coming out, you can always sharpen after the fact to make it more sharp. But I find that the dynamic range and the quality of when you're shooting blacks and things looks really nice on the Sony, even coming out 1080p 50 megabit per second. So something there. Whereas if you're doing lots of movement, more run and gun style videos, you know, maybe it's more of a, well, I mean, vlogging is something we're going to talk about, but if it was more run and gun, out and about all the time, shooting friends, you know, shooting a lot more off the cuff, left setup, I would probably go the Panasonic route, because it's just smoother video, and that rolling shutter is going to come into play on the Sony if you're really jerking that camera around a lot. It's going to be a little bit smoother on the Panasonic. So something to consider there. Let's talk about usability between these two cameras and some of the main features in them. One that people talk about a lot is focusing and autofocusing. If you don't need autofocusing, good for you. But for a lot of people are using more and more of those autofocus capabilities, Sony's autofocus is way better than Panasonic's, because they've got contrast and phase detection, two different technologies working together, and they can smoothly nail the focus all of the time. And you can see here I'm shooting pretty shallow. I've got the autofocus set on the 6500, and it just tracks everything that I'm doing. And I know I can take something, throw it up to the screen, it's going to lock on the focus there. I pull it away and I'm going to be back in focus. That is going to be much slower on the Panasonic, and it's also going to do a lot more hunting where you'll see it go in focus, out of focus. That's because Panasonic just has contrast detection autofocus. Now, if you're doing more cinematic things, you're probably going to be doing more manual focus, and you may not use that. But there are even a growing number of professionals that are using autofocus in camera and relying on that. Even the new Canon C100 Mark II, like a $10,000 camera, maybe it's a C300, has their autofocus, Canon's great dual pixel built into it, a $10,000 professional camera, because more professionals want to be able to use that. And so if you heavily rely on something that needs autofocus, Sony is going to be way better. Let's talk a little bit about audio. There's lots of options between both brands to be able to plug microphones into them. Not all cameras can do it. This 5100, there's no option to add, you know, a microphone onto it. The 6000 series on Sony, more options. A6000, you can't, doesn't have a microphone jack, but you can get a Sony mic that goes right into the hot shoe. 6300, 6500, they get actual plug-in microphones. Obviously the full frame options on Sony, there's lots there. Panasonic, this GX85 doesn't have an option to add a microphone, but the G85, the G7, the GH series, the GX8, there's lots more where you can add them. What I really like about Panasonic is they have limiters built in for their microphones that are, you can switch on and off. Basically, if you get too loud, it just brings the audio volume down. I use that a lot when I was vlogging because it would just manage the audio. I could turn the audio up to a higher volume, and if I was about to go over it, it would turn it down. Whereas a Sony, I find I have to leave the volume lower so I don't accidentally go over because it doesn't limit it as well. So again, you can fix that in post. It's just a little bit of a time saver. Talking about screens and touch screens, this is a big difference between these two platforms. Sony, you can get some touchscreens on the cameras. 5100 has it, that 6500 has it, but you basically can just tap for focusing, and that's about it. Whereas on Panasonic, you can get all the menu settings, you can touch everything, you can manage everything with the touchscreen, and it's much nicer and much faster. When I flip back to this, I forget this at times, and I'm using the buttons to go down and forgetting, oh yeah, right, I can just tap here. So, you know, do you have to have that? No, but it is handy, as well as Panasonic has options for flip-out screens. And this is something that Sony does not have, a camera that you can add a microphone to and have a screen that can see yourself. Whereas Panasonic, you can do that. And we'll talk a little bit about vlogging, how important that little combination is there to be able to see yourself on a screen and have a microphone that you add onto it. What else can we talk about? I think something that's really important to mention can be heat issues. Sony's can have problems with overheating. Now, on the A6500, this is one that, and the 6300, lots of people talk about when you're shooting and recording 4K, the cameras could overheat. Now, they have this option to be able to override that if you're on a tripod. I've done that, and I've never run into overheating issues on this camera since I have done that. A5100, somebody left a nasty comment because I didn't mention about the overheating issues. I never, ever, ever had an overheating issue with my 5100 until earlier today when I was going to record something and it overheated, and I've never had that happen before. So if you're doing really long runs of recording, it's something to be aware of and to keep in mind. Now, in the case of this, I had HDMI out going to a monitor, and I was recording and had the screen on, and it was on for a long time before I recorded, but I was still surprised that, you know, it's overheating. That really shouldn't be happening, but it can happen with the Sonys. So long periods of recording time or a lot of recording, that I think can be a little bit of a hindrance. Every camera seems to be a little different in how it responds to that, but something to be aware of. Panasonic, I've never run into any overheating issues. Let's talk specifically about vlogging between these two platforms. For me, there's kind of a few factors for vlogging that are going to make your decision. One, first and foremost, having the selfie screen is incredibly valuable for vlogging. Not that you want to be staring at the screen because that looks awkward and people can tell that you're not looking directly into the camera, but for being able to set up those shots and make sure that everything looks okay, that maybe your lines are straight behind you of what's in the shot, to make sure that your face isn't too dark, that your face is in focus, that all the things are right about your shot are really, really handy. Whereas if you don't have that, you're kind of trusting the camera and guessing. Now, in the case of the Sony, I don't have to worry about being in focus or out of focus because the focus is always nailed. But what I found with the Sony is there's been times where I haven't realized that it was too bright behind me and the camera didn't pick up my face, and so suddenly my face is like black and the background's correctly exposed. And I didn't notice that till afterwards because I couldn't see it. Because on the 6500, there's no selfie screen option. Now, I could vlog with this 5100. One, there's no 4K, maybe not the end of the world. But this one, I can't add a microphone to it. Sony does not make a package where you can have a microphone and a screen where you can see yourself. And I think that's a problem. So for vlogging, I have to recommend Panasonic. You're gonna find there's gonna be a couple of times where your shots are gonna be out of focus because the focus missed on the Panasonic. But when you should be able to notice that in the screen when you're kind of setting up before, you got to give it a little bit more time to be able to do that. But especially when you're starting out vlogging, or really I think just vlogging in general, having that screen to be aware of what's going on around you is so, so important. On the other side though, where Sony I think shines and is amazing is in videos like this. It's sitting on a tripod, it's shooting in 4K, and what I really needed to do is to focus brilliantly and be able to blur that background behind me, and it just works for that. With Panasonic one, you'd have to get a much more expensive lens to be able to blur this background this much, and as I move forward and backwards, it would be doing a lot of hunting. And to really crank it down and put it on manual focus means that if I move this much, I would be out of focus. Compared to moving here, I'd probably also be a little bit out of focus, whereas here I'd be in focus. On the Sony, I know that it's just tracking those movements. And so for a setting like this where I'm not out and about running and gunning, I've got a big monitor here that I can see myself, just a cheap whatever computer monitor. That ends up working for me being able to see myself where I don't necessarily need that selfie screen to be able to do it in this kind of setting. Other thing I should mention about screens on the Sony, the 6500 and the 6300, when they're shooting 4K or 120 frames per second, their screens have to dim and they're completely unusable outside. And that ends up being a problem where you need to add a monitor if you're outside and need to be able to see what you're shooting. Some of it is you can basically read off the bottom, off the exposure meter to know if you're, properly exposed and then you can rely that the autofocus is going to pick it up. So I've been able to kind of get around that without an extra screen, but it's something I'm going to have to invest in to just make sure if you're shooting anything professionally outside, that is going to be a little bit of an issue. Panasonic screens are much, much brighter. Again, that's a lot of information. We're recapping so many different features of these cameras. And again, cameras have strengths, cameras have weaknesses. I would say the Panasonic cameras have combined a lot more better implementations of the features, whereas the Sonys, they have a couple of things they do really well, and then they have a bunch of issues throughout other features, but those can be make or break features, such as the focusing on the Sony, or those low light or blurring the background capabilities. You simply cannot get that in the Panasonic side of things. Whereas Panasonic, they do so many of those things well, between the touchscreens and the selfie screens and the vlogging options and the audio options and the colors, and there's so many things that are stacked up over on this side. You just know that you're going to have to compromise on, it's not going to be quite as good in low light, it's not going to be able to blur the background the same way, and it's not going to focus as well. And so you just have to decide what's on the other side. Again, you can get around any of those issues when you've got a great story or a great presenter, craft your story well, and know what you're doing. So if you are in the land of indecision, you're saying, I just don't know what to get between these two cameras, flip a coin, pick one, and just get out there and shoot. That is the thing that matters the absolute most. I'd love to hear you guys' comments, your feedback, what kind of stuff you shoot, why you've picked the platform that you have you switched between them, what made your decision. In the end, it's just about your own creativity. I'm Justin Rivas. Thank you for watching this long video. Appreciate it.